Okay, welcome back to Gary's Economics. Today we are going to explain why the rich get richer. Alright, so I was talking the other day to a good friend of mine, a Dutch guy who I studied economics with back at Oxford when I was doing my masters in 17 to 19. And when I was at Oxford, I was very adamant that the economy would get worse and worse for ordinary people. Living standards would fall because inequality was increasing and increasing. Now, this is not a popular idea in modern university academic economics, and this guy sort of was quite skeptical at the time. But it's obviously been 5 or 6 years since then, and he and I and you have seen inequality massively increase and living standards massively decrease. And he's kind of started to be convinced that I'm correct, which if you stick with my channel for long enough and keep seeing my predictions be right, hopefully you will be too. So he messaged me the other day and he was like, look, I think you're right. Inequality is just destroying the economy. I think it's important. We need to do something about it. But he asked me, why is it that suddenly now, in the last 20 years, 10 years, especially the last 5 years, why is inequality increasing now? What is actually causing the increase in inequality? And I thought that was a really interesting question, something that was worth discussing and explaining on the channel. So I think the first thing you need to know in order to answer that question is that for the vast majority of human history, at least in the last 2,000 years, human societies have been extremely unequal and living standards have been, in most cases, very, very low. It was only really after the Second World War that inequality decreased significantly in parts of the world, here in the UK, in Western Europe, North America, places like Japan. But of course, in the rest of the world, inequality stayed very high and living standards stayed very low. But if you go back and look before World War II, basically most of history is extremely unequal societies. So I think in order to answer the question, why is inequality rising now, you first need to understand that really it is the last 70 years that are the exception. What we have had is an exceptional period only in certain places, which is that Western Europe, North America, Japan, Australia, a few other places have had historically very equal low inequality societies for 70 years and very high living standards. That's not normal. That didn't exist almost ever, basically. It was a specific period. So the reason that I mention that is it's not actually something unusual that is happening now, that inequality is becoming very large. This is actually the norm. So I think if we look at human history, we kind of have to accept that human societies tend towards very high levels of inequality. And we have a few examples in the last 70 years of places where that didn't happen. So let's discuss why it happens, why the inequality grows, in the context of this basically always happens. And what I said to my friend was really it's very simple. So you can look at it in the very specific case, which is in our societies that we live in now, what happens is you go to work, you get paid your 30, 40 grand a year, you spend almost all of it on rent, mortgage, food, bills, and it goes towards the owners of the properties, the owners of the debt, the owners of the production of the things that you need, which is essentially rich people. So you go to work, you make 40 grand, you give it all to rich people, they use that to buy the rest of the assets. It's a relatively simple dynamic. I've spoken about it a lot on the channel. But this is the specific case. I think what this is a specific example of basically a more general concept, which is when power is unequally distributed, people who have a lot of power, which in our society basically means rich people, can use that power to dispossess the less powerful. So in our society, that means rich people use your salary, which you've paid to them, they give it to their kids, their kids buy your house, your kids don't have a house. But this could manifest differently in different ways. This is simply a specific case of the general rule that when power is unequal, the powerful can dispossess the weak. And this leads very naturally to an accumulation of power. I'm powerful, you're not. I use that power to take your stuff. And You can see this happen if you look throughout sort of the history of medieval Europe. What you saw was, for a period, there was lots of small states, and then when certain kingdoms became powerful, they used that power to take the kingdoms around them. It's another example of this, you know. This is why human history tends towards high levels of inequality, because once you have inequality, then the rich can use their power to dispossess the weak. And that's all of history. That's all of history. That is what happens in human societies. If you look at the history of human societies have always been very unequal, except for one period in time, 70 years after the Second World War, when a lot of societies suddenly became much more equal. Why was that? I think the best clue I always remember, there's a song by the Beatles. I'm a big fan of the Beatles. First time I mentioned that on the channel. Called Taxman. Yeah, one of the opening lines of the song, it's written from the perspective of the taxman, which says, 1 for you, 19 for me. And this is because the Beatles, at the peak of their success, were paying a 95% top income tax rate in the UK. Now, I'm not advocating for a 95% top income tax rate. The top inheritance tax rate at the time was 90%. During that period, up until the 80s specifically, we had in Western Europe and also in America, which has a reputation as a low tax society, up until the 80s, we had extremely high tax rates on the very rich. And that basically prevented the rich from rapidly accumulating wealth of the rest of their countries. That is the exception. That is the exception. If you have systems that prevent the rich and the powerful from taking the wealth and power of the poor, then you can prevent it. If you don't have those systems, you can't prevent it. So the reason that inequality is increasing is that the rich are very powerful, and they can use the income that they get from you to take the rest of the stuff. And this is always the way it has been, and it's always the way it will be. But I don't want to be excessively fatalistic here, because I see people in the comments all the time saying it was always like that, it was always like that. Listen, we had 70 years when it was not like that. We had 70 years when inequality was unusually low in a lot of countries, especially, you know, most of the countries of Western Europe. And that was 70 years in which postmen and cleaners and hairdressers could buy houses and go on holidays and raise families and afford space. This is not the norm. This is not the norm. But we had that because we had very high rates of tax on wealthier people. Listen, you need that. You need to have structures in place in your economy that prevent the rich from taking all of the wealth. If you don't have that, history teaches us the rich get all of the wealth. And once the rich have all of the wealth, not just history, but the present world shows us, ordinary people end up with very poor living conditions. You know, if you go to countries that are very unequal, if you go to, I mean, it's most of the world, to be honest. You go to places like India, South Africa, you know, almost anywhere in Latin America, very unequal societies lead to very poor living standards. This is the norm. We prevented it before. We prevented it by levying very high tax rates on the very, very rich. So, you know I see people in the comments all the time accusing me of being a communist because I want high tax rates on the rich. Listen, I'm a trader in my heart of hearts. I made a lot of money betting on this. I'm still betting on it now. My firm belief is that if you don't tax rich people, living standards collapse for ordinary people. It's happening now. It will continue to happen. We can reverse it, but we need to tax the rich. I'm not talking about you, Dave, in the comments, who's an accountant making 60 grand. I'm talking about families with 10 million, 100 million pounds in assets. If you don't tax them, they'll take everything. That includes all of your assets. Your kids will be poor. Your grandkids will be poor. You won't own anything. You need to protect yourself from the people who are taking your assets. That is the rich. We're fighting against it. Support the channel. Educate yourself. Educate your friends. Educate your family. If enough people say no, we can change it, just like we changed it after World War II. But it needs enough people to step forward and push back. I'm pushing. I hope you'll push too. Thank you very much.